Here's what's going to happen. DOD is going to have to issue sources sought, RFIs, asking, are there any CMMC level 2 certified companies that can even do this work? If you're certified, there is a potential that you can limit the competition. Hello, it's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Mr. Derek Kernus from Aethon Security. How are you, Derek?
Hey, Jacob, I'm well.
Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all the things. Helps me out. Thanks in advance. Derek, tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
I was interning at a government contractor back in 2019 when I was in a master's program, and they had asked me to help the organization become compliant with NIST 800 171, and it was something I had never heard of. So they sent me an 8-hour webinar. I think it was from Lockheed Martin. And in the first 10 minutes of that webinar, Katie Arrington had mentioned the CMMC program. Mm-hmm. Once I put that together, I was like, if this actually happens, it's going to be a big deal. Yeah. And kept following it, kept tracking it, worked with that organization to get them compliant, and ultimately ended up starting my own company, helping other contractors meet those requirements in the CMMC program.
That's awesome. And today we're going to talk about the business case for CMMC for making that security and compliance investment, because it takes resources, it takes manpower, it takes cost and schedule and all of those things. So very happy to discuss all of that with you here today. Well, why don't you go ahead and dive in, talk to us about all of that, and also the different ways that companies can kind of address this security and compliance problem.
Yeah, so I've seen quite a bit over the past 6 years with organizations deciding when to do this, making the business case for it, either to their leadership if they're in more of a decision influencing role, or whether they're actually part of the decision-making team. And as we're coming up on the 48 CFR CMMC rule, or the CMMC acquisition rule, obviously a lot of organizations feel like that they're getting a lot closer to having to make that decision about when to really get started. Because we've seen a lot of statistics. I mean, one that I've quoted recently is I saw on Cybersheet's website that only 4% of contractors in the defense industrial base are actually meeting the requirements or feel like they're there. The other 96% are working on it or thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And what we've really seen, especially with what's going on with this administration and what DOGE has done to government contracting over the past few months, and I think that organizations that take CMMC seriously and they begin to get certified early in the program, when it's enforceable in government contracts and DoD contracts specifically, they're going to see a competitive advantage that is going to really catapult their business to the next level.
I had, as you well know, an interesting experience recently. I was previously at a defense contractor, and we were well on our way to CMMC, our CMMC assessment certification. And so I'd been working on this NIST 800 171 compliance thing for a long time, for years, prepping us. And unfortunately, impacted by DOGE. And so my thought goes to those companies that have done nothing. Because it takes money to do this. It takes money to, whether or not you try to do it yourself, or you hire an MSP to come on board and help with that. All of that takes money. So my thought goes to a lot of small businesses out there that may be impacted by DOGE as we were, and then you lose your contracts, or maybe a large contract that was bringing in a lot of funds that you really would need to be able to pay for the compliance and preparation for CMMC. The revenue loss, just from what I've seen, is I think is going to be a big impact for small businesses going forward.
I agree. And we've seen it impact our clients directly. Aethon Security, we're an external service provider, a member of the MSP Collective, like your now employer Summit 7. So we are supporting defense industrial base and contractors of all sizes. And we've had some clients that they actually canceled their contract with us because they had lost a bunch of revenue and ended up kind of restructuring and coming back on with a smaller number of users. We've also seen some clients who were very hesitant to keep moving forward with their project because they were cut. And the conversation that I think we're going to dive more into today, it is the same conversation I had with them to say, look, I'm not trying to sell you on CMMC and staying our client, but I'd like you to look at this from a different angle, because while you have had your revenue cut, look at what's happening with DOGE, at least with your contracts. You've been hit more in other areas, looking at how do you make yourself more competitive in a tough market. And with everyone talking about CMMC and the lack of action by a lot of the contracting base, it's kind of that old adage where, like, when there's blood in the water, make money, right? There's an opportunity to make money here. And this is really what's happening. I think organizations that take it seriously the first year or two, they will have an opportunity to earn some contracts, get some awards that maybe weren't originally on the business development pipeline.
Yes, I completely agree. There was a quote from Leidos that Daniel Akeridge shared with me when he came on the podcast. And basically the quote was, we can no longer choose the companies that we think are the best to subcontract. We have to choose the compliant ones. So if you're a subcontractor, it's a huge opportunity to come into that CMMC certification, get that done early. And I mean, there's thousands upon thousands of companies that are not going to be certified probably this year. We'll see it accelerate and all of those things. The early adoption, I think, as you said, it'll be a big competitive differentiator. And honestly, it could be the key to, if you have a lot of work in DoD, I think it'll be key to surviving in this environment.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I can tell you, we've talked to a couple of very large prime contractors that they have 500-600 subcontractors in their supply chain, and they have no idea where they are in their compliance journey. And it's getting to that point where some of the larger primes appear to be trying to get involved in their subcontractors' compliance journey in order to basically manage it and ensure that their supply chain can exist once the CMMC program becomes enforceable in DoD contracts. And that's where, as we continue to see that situation evolve, the ones that are already certified, like you said, Jacob, they're going to be able to go to these prime contractors and say, hey, just wave in front of them, almost kind of like, sometimes I know some 8A companies like to do the same thing. Hey, we're 8A. You can just direct award to us. This is great. Kind of the same thing, but it opens up that playing field to those that are properly protecting that information. The other thing that I think it's going to be able to do for companies that maybe want to take that next step to being a prime is it's an opportunity to shape. This is something that I've been saying for quite a while, and Jacob Horn and James Galuli at CS2 Reston a couple of weeks ago, they kind of alluded to a similar concept where the CMMC rollout is more of a guideline, right? And something that organizations that are level 2 certified already will be able to do is when they're shaping an opportunity, they can say, hey, in that first year, put the CMMC level 2 certification requirement in here instead of the self-certification requirement, and mold that opportunity, unless it's in one of those 5 defense groupings in the CUI registry. It's already going to have a level 2 requirement, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some opportunities now for contractors to use it to their competitive advantage as part of that phased rollout approach.
Yeah, Derek, I definitely agree with that. Here's what's going to happen. DoD and this initial phase-in period that's going to happen here pretty quickly is going to have to issue sources sought, RFIs, asking, are there any CMMC level 2 certified companies that can even do this work? This year, hopefully we'll have a few to several hundred, that are certified, but it's going to take a while for the supply chain to ramp up and get certified. So in this process, the normal contracting process of issuing RFIs, of issuing those sources sought and responding to those, if you're certified, there is a potential that you can limit the competition based on if there's enough companies that are certified and you're part of that group, if they can say, yes, there's enough competition out there, and we're going to add a CMMC level 2 certification requirement to this opportunity. And that's going to be a very small bucket of companies, in the beginning stages. So exactly right. Shaping those opportunities to our advantage is something that should definitely be done. And you can definitely do that if you're CMMC level 2 certified early.
To that point, if it plays out like that, which I agree with, then we're going to see the mad rush. And that's what a lot of MSPs and MSSPs, external service providers in this space, are trying to plan for and prepare for. And it's going to become a massive bottleneck. Because here's what I'm very intrigued by, specifically from the last stats that I looked at were the Cyber 8B's April town hall. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the exact numbers. I remember approximate, but it was about 150 organizations had what I know, again, Jacob Horn has mentioned as a false starts, right? They didn't pass the phase 1 assessment. 150 organizations since the CMMC program became finalized in December. I think the number was around 85 contractors, or I should say 85 organizations have earned a CMMC level 2 certification since then. So here's the next thing is that what we know is that at least 16 of those organizations are external service providers and maybe dabble a little bit in government contracting themselves, maybe not. Like I know Summit 7 does. We don't do government contracting, but let's just say none of them do. So really 70 contractors as of April, and I know the number's gone up in the May numbers, but I wasn't at that town hall. But 70 contractors have a level 2 certification, and I think there's an estimate of maybe 100 or 200 for the JSVAs that were official 110 scores, right? Mm-hmm. So if we leave those JSVAs out for a moment, let's just say approximately only 1/3 of the companies that have signed up for level 2 assessment have actually gotten through an assessment and gotten certified. So those are factual numbers from the Cyber 8B. Here's what's anecdotal I was very interested in what the number of contractors were that got certified that were using an MSP or an MSSP. So I started asking around my C3PAO network. And the collective number, after I put it all together, was about 80 to 85% of the contractors that got certified were using an external service provider.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So what I can tell you from firsthand experience and conversations with contractors looking for a mock assessment, there's a lot of concern that they're not doing the right thing. And I can tell you that the mock assessments that I've done so far, they were not ready.
Yeah.
They thought they were ready. Some of them knew that they might not be.
Yeah.
But some of them were really confident. And going in assessment, they thought that they understood what the assessment objectives were and what the intent was. And we went in and had to explain to them that, hey, like this is actually one of the biggest ones that I've seen is that they're opening themselves up to contractor risk managed assets and actually didn't understand what that scoping asset category was.
Yes.
And then also not even writing the SSP to the 320 assessment objectives, which made the mock assessment more difficult.
Yeah.
Right. And then we start playing this guessing game. So I think there are a lot of organizations that are going to need a lot of help where there are truly very few service providers that are equipped and staffed to appropriately support them. Mm-hmm. Then after that, this is where the real biggest bottleneck is, in my opinion, is the C3PAOs, and more specifically, the number of lead CMMC assessors. Mm-hmm. And I know I can think of three lead assessors off the top of my head, and I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. I don't intend to do assessments. That's not the role that I play in the ecosystem, but I'm a lead assessor. And I know two other ones that they also don't plan to do assessments, or in their current role, they don't assessors. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a lead assessor on every assessment. And I think there's maybe 200 now.
Yeah.
So there can only be 200 assessment teams, but how many of them are actually going to be doing assessments?
Right.
So we don't know what the ecosystem can actually support at the moment to do assessments. And for the C3POs that I socialize with, a lot of them are booked out through October or November of this year. Mm-hmm. One of them is booked out through March of next year.
Yeah.
Right. There are a lot of steps to getting certified that contractors need to start thinking about from the business perspective. And it's kind of like the 7 Habits, the Stephen Covey book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the tenets of that is start with the end in mind.
Yes.
That's where it becomes very challenging. When do I need to be certified? When do I need my organization to be certified, and then work backwards? But organizations need to be very honest with themselves and realize that they may not know what they don't know about the process to get certified, and start having those conversations with consultants and professionals that, in my opinion, should have the CCP or CCA at a minimum, and that are plugged into this ecosystem so they can understand the path.
Yes, exactly. That's a really interesting stat on the number of now certified organizations that employed ESPs or MSPs. That's 85%. I can understand why. Like, even if you have IT and like cybersecurity staff, and even if they have like RMF background and stuff like that, which is helpful, there's still like CMMC isms, right?
Yeah.
It is a different type of perspective posed from RMF, because actually when I came on board to my previous company, I came on to do an RMF ATO, got that done, then shifted into corporate security. And it's honestly a bit embarrassing as to what my conclusions were back then based on my RMF knowledge, and not knowing like what NIST 800-171 was actually focused on. Because RMF, I mean, you're looking at a system and just the whole system, it's not where the data flows per se, it's just the system. So, and then there are the asset types, as you mentioned, CRMAs being one of them that I think a lot of people misunderstand. And I even misunderstood it. There are so many details that can just bite you so hard. So like my advice to people, if you do have IT people in-house and cyber people in-house, send them to CMMC certified professional training. Because without that, there's just going to be mistakes made because they don't know. And it could be big mistakes that result in that false start that you alluded to. Because an assessor, what will have to happen is they go through phase 1, just the readiness, making sure you're actually ready to go. So they'll ask for your documentation, and they'll sit down with you and verify that you're actually ready to perform the actual assessment, where they go through every assessment objective. And as you said, I believe it was 150 false starts. And in this environment, the way scheduling is, if your assessment was today, false start, you could be looking at rescheduling 6 to 8 months down the road. So you want to get it right. You don't want to mess this up and be pushed out the schedule that far, because that is huge. And you mentioned a mock assessment. Can you walk us through what that looks like?
Mock assessments that are being offered in the marketplace, it's going to depend based on who you're having do the mock assessment. So C3PAOs can do the mock assessment if it's their client for an actual CMMC assessment. And it's basically, I think that some of them are calling it a readiness assessment, but essentially it gives a contractor maybe a potential lower cost or a higher probability of keeping their actual assessment date, where they can have their environment assessed against the 320 assessment objectives without consulting. So it's basically, met, not met for each assessment objective. And then they can go about their way and fix anything that's maybe marked not met. And it makes the actual assessment more efficient potentially, because the C3PAO already has a very strong familiarity with the CMMC system, the CMMC level 2 environment, and they can go through a little bit quicker, and there might be some efficiencies there. Now, on the other side, with an organization like us, we're not a C3PAO, but we have CMMC certified assessors on staff. We can do a mock assessment for you and take you through that actual assessment experience. But we're very happy to provide consulting and information and guidance on here's where your gaps, here's what you need to do to close them, because we're not trying to earn your business as a C3PAO. There's a very strong ethical line there enforced by the Cyber 8B to make sure that there's no consulting. So what we're finding in the marketplace, I think what a lot of other consultants are finding in the marketplace, is that there's a strong need and desire for a mock assessment for organizations that have been working on this internally for a while, because they want to have a very high level of assurance going into that assessment that they can pass that phase one and be ready because of the business timelines, right? It may not be because of opportunities we have in our pipeline, or potentially with a contract renewal that we have coming up where it has the DFAR 7012 clause in it. We know that we're handling CUI, and we know that it fits one of those 5 defense groupings. So it's going to have a level 2 requirement when the program becomes enforceable in contracts. We cannot afford to have it wait 6 months, right? All of these business things we need to be looking at. And leadership, senior leadership in organizations and those decision makers really need to be paying close attention to this and not putting their head in the sand on it, because it will have major business implications once the program gets fully up and running.
If folks want to engage with a managed service provider to manage their IT, to help with the policies, processes, all of those things, what does that look like in the marketplace these days?
So there are a lot of different providers in the space providing a lot of different offerings. There's consultants that are purely providing consulting and advisory services. There's organizations that purely provide support writing all the documentation on your covered contractor information system and the whole information security program. There are consultants out there that all they do are technical engineering projects. There are MSSPs where all they do is security monitoring once you've built your environment. There are organizations that are white gloving it, putting everything together. So the first thing that organizations need to be doing is really identifying internally, what are our needs? Where do we truly need help? And then obviously going to look for that. That can be a little bit challenging. You're going to have to just understand and accept early that you're probably going to have quite a few conversations with different organizations and do some research to understand what their offerings are, and then go from there. And I would say, don't be scared to just have the conversations. I feel like a lot of contractors are really not putting in the time and the effort that's needed to really explore what is required to meet this requirement and the cost. It's about having a conversation with the MSP, with the external service provider, with the consultant, and getting budget numbers. Don't be afraid to get numbers, because that's going to help you start planning out your whole journey.
And one thing that I just have to highlight here, because I've had other folks on the podcast talk about what most MSPs look like. And most MSPs have no business supporting defense contractors because oh my goodness, there is a huge level of effort that goes into just the compliance aspect, and you have to have a shared responsibility matrix and all of these things. Tell us about the collective. Actually, this would be really good to hear about.
The MSP Collective is a group of managed service providers, external service providers that are very focused on protecting critical infrastructure in the United States. So it's a group of like-minded, what I like to say, and I think many of us do, is we're friendly competitors. We know that there's enough opportunity. Of course, we're all business people, but we're cybersecurity professionals. We care about the United States, our citizens, and protecting critical infrastructure. From my understanding, I think most of our members are CMMC level 2 certified ourselves, if not all of them. And I think most of them are working on it, if they're not certified already. But that being said, the point is that we believe that managed service providers supporting critical infrastructure have a higher bar. Because if you think about it, we are force multipliers for bad actors and nation states getting into contractors, right? So we need to be at a higher bar for the security we're providing, because the truth is we're connected to many contractors. All of us are. So that's also another reason that they're not every provider in this space that believes that as part of the MSP Collective. I don't want to put that out there either. But the point is I see this very regularly, especially more recently, that, contractors are talking to us, talking to our friendly competitors, and they're working with MSPs that are suggesting that they can get their client compliant because they have them locked into a 2 or 3 year contract. I have a list of questions that I provide contractors. Say, just ask these questions and see what they say. And if the answer is not this or in this realm, they're probably not going to be a good fit for you and get you across the finish line. And the majority of the time, they're not answering the questions and demonstrating expertise. And it's really because, again, my opinion, they're trying to just save their business and not really doing the right thing, right? And I've actually had I've had an MSP reach out to us through our website, asking us to help them get compliant with CMMC Level 2. While on their website, I went and I looked at it. They were telling everyone that they could get them compliant with Level 2 and we'll get you across the finish line. And I'm like, really? Like, you're going to basically falsely advertise very publicly and put people's businesses at risk potentially and just take their money and say that you can get them across the finish line. This happens every day, all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the MSPs don't want to let them out of that contract because I get it, it's business, but there needs to be some ethical decision making here. We're like, if you come to us and say, hey, help us with SOC 2, I understand SOC 2 because I read the CISSP study guide, but I don't know anything about getting a SOC 2, attestation or affirmation or whatever it's called. I know from Troy Fine, it's definitely not a certification, but I'm not going to tell you I'm going to do that. I'm going to refer you to somebody else. That's what I really think external service providers and managed service providers that don't live in our world, they need to be doing. I'm not saying they can't train up and get there, but don't use your current clients as your test bed. It's getting to a more serious point where that's not good for their business.
Yeah. Exactly right. Hey folks, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Vanta. Is your manual GRC program slowing you down? Well, there's something more efficient than spreadsheets, screenshots, and manual processes, Vanta. With Vanta, GRC can be so much easier while also strengthening your security posture and driving revenue for your business. Vanta automates key areas of your GRC program, including compliance, risk, and customer trust, and it streamlines the way you manage all of this information. And the impact is real. A recent IDC analysis found that compliance teams using Vanta are 129% more productive. So get back time to focus on strengthening security and scaling your business. Get started at vanta.com/GRC Academy. That's VANTA.com/GRC Academy. Now back to the episode. Let's talk about the money piece and getting quotes from service providers, from MSPs to C3PAOs.
So there's a wide gamut of price ranges, right? Like there's some MSPs out there that they're going to evaluate what your current environment is like and what work maybe you've put in up to that point, and then based on whatever you've determined that your gaps and your needs are and what level of support you want, they're going to be very a la carte. They're going to price it based on exactly what you're looking for. There are other providers out there where they're going to say, look, this is our package and we have package 1, 2, 3. You can buy one of these. This is our program. There are organizations out there that they basically sell pre-built enclaves, right? And you can buy that. You're not 100% covered there, by the way. You still have responsibilities. No matter what anyone says, you have things. Yeah, you have things that you have to do, and it's not just 8 things. So once we've determined what we're looking for, then we have to go get the quotes. And I just say there is a wide range. It can be 5 figures. It can be 6 figures. It really does depend on what your operational needs are and what your IT needs are. Organizations that have a little more simple operational structure, like maybe let's just say you're handling Google Docs or Office 365 documents and PDFs, going to be a lot different than a manufacturing environment or a software developer, things like that. So we have to always keep that in perspective. I'm a person where I'm not going to give a number because I think every situation is different. It really does depend on what your IT needs are and how your organization is structured. Now, what I will say is for the C3PAOs, I think it's become pretty widely known that it's the average right now is about $50K for an assessment. So I have seen numbers lower than that. I've certainly seen numbers higher than that. And it is very relative, again, to how your environment is built, whether it's 100% in the cloud, whether you have on-premises infrastructure, and the depth and breadth of the entire environment itself. How many, if it's as on-premises or hybrid architecture, how many sites does the C3PAO need to go visit as part of that assessment? They don't have to visit all of them, but they're going to have to do a mix, right? That's going to affect the cost. So that's why I always advise organizations, if it's possible, scope out your on-premises environment as much as possible. If you're a manufacturer, obviously that's not going to be possible at all.
Yeah.
But if you can avoid using removable media, if you can avoid printing in your cloud native organization, that's going to be to your benefit in an assessment. I will say that, in my opinion, I work very hard for our clients, and I'm sure other external service providers that are level 2 certified, we try to negotiate a better rate for our clients because we don't have to be evaluated in the assessment. So a very common misconception right now, and I'll be the first to tell you, I misunderstood this because it's very unclear to me in the 32 CFR rule. Our services have to be evaluated in the assessment, but the tools and the things that we use to support our clients, they were evaluated in our CMMC level 2 certification assessment. So our environment that we use to support our clients doesn't have to be evaluated. If an organization is using an MSP that is not certified, they're considered a security protection asset in the CMMC program. That whole IT environment, everything that's relevant to NIST 800-171 will have to be evaluated as part of that scope. I can guarantee you C3PAOs are going to charge more than $50K for that because they're essentially evaluating another environment. Maybe not all 110 controls, but they're having to evaluate another MSP. And as kind of another anecdote to that, I've even talked to a C3PAO that told me straight up that they are not going to evaluate, or they're not going to do a certification assessment for any organization that's using an MSP that's not level 2 certified. They think it's too much of a legal risk.
That is great information. And I can certainly understand their perspective because there's so many aspects when it comes to an MSP and their environment and what they're using and all of that. It would have to be almost a completely separate assessment if they weren't already certified. So you really get a picture, of the risk involved in all of that. So that's very interesting. So I think the bottom line, folks, is look for CMMC level 2 certified MSPs. If you need an MSP, and look at the MSP Collective, look at Aethon, look at Summit 7, whom I just joined last month, and all these other great folks, But the key is make sure that at the least they have a shared responsibility matrix for CMMC. They have CMMC certified assessors on staff. Ideally, they're also CMMC level 2 certified or will be in the very near future. Let's talk about framing CMMC to internal leadership. And I'll just start out by saying, I remember doing this myself when I came on board to my previous job. I was there for almost 8 years. And after that RMF project rolled off, I shifted over into corporate security. And the way that I know a lot of people have challenges with this. How do I convince leadership that we have to do this, that this is worth the investment? And certainly years ago, it was self-attestation of compliance, and there was no third party mechanism to check that you were actually doing the things that you said you were doing. And I think, at least back then, you tie it back to the contractual requirements. And oftentimes it's making them aware, oh, we do have contractual requirements that we have to account for and that we're accountable to. And we're signing on the dotted line saying, yes, we've done all of this. Because I think a lot of it's been an awareness problem. I think in some situations it's been just flat out, they don't care and they're not going to do it, unfortunately. But these days, now we have the CMMC train that's just about to seriously take off here and be implemented in contracts. Yeah. Yes. After so many years, of talking about it, which is an amazing place to be. So now the conversation shifts not only from, we're self-attesting to we very well could have a level 2 certification requirement in an opportunity that we want to go after. So how would you frame this to leadership and convince them to, to make the investment now, opposed to waiting, continuing to wait and see what happens?
The first thing that I would do is try to get a picture of how much of the organization's revenue is DoD contracts that are handling CUI. So first looking at that and really then going to all the DoD contracts. Guys, step one, look at the overall revenue for the organization and then determine how much of that is DoD contracts. Take those DoD contracts and go through them. And I think it's like section L or section M of the contract. Look for that DFARS clause, DFARS 252.204-7012. Now, technically, I think, it's becoming better known that that's supposed to be in every DoD contract, but it typically isn't. And what has typically been happening is if there's going to be CUI handled in that contract, then they're putting the 7012 clause in there. So I will, say up front that just because that 7012 clause is there doesn't always mean that there's CUI being handled on that contract. But from what we've seen, it's a very, very strong likelihood. And then if you want to really get into it, you can purchase tools. You may already have them in your environment where you can search data and look for CUI markings. Personally, I would look for distribution statements. We have typically found that the government for a long time has been putting distribution statements C and D on documents that are CUI, but they haven't been actually putting the CUI markings. But again, I want to be clear, just because it has distribution statements C and D on it doesn't necessarily mean that it's CUI. So there isn't 100% guaranteed way most of the time, because the government will be the first to tell you they have not done a good job of marking CUI. But this gets you started down that path, because really at the end of the day, your first step is identifying how much of our revenue is tied up in DoD contracts where we handle CUI. If that number is above a certain threshold, or even if it's real dollars that are very important to you, maybe it's 5% of the overall revenue, but you're a $1 billion company, so that means it's $50 million, and you don't want to lose $50 million, then you're going to make a decision and say, well, let's go explore how much it costs to get us compliant based on what we know the IT environment needs to be like for these contracts. That's step one. Step two is then having that conversation to say, if we decide, okay, we're going to need to move forward with this because it's enough of our revenue or it's enough real dollars where we feel like we need to explore it, then I would have that conversation about, hey, we've actually been contractually required to do this for 9 years now, and we haven't, to get them to understand the legal risk. And a lot of organizations that I've talked to, like, they kind of sweep that part under the rug, but it's basically like going down a 4-lane highway at 70 miles an hour when the speed limit's 55, but maybe you didn't see that sign. The state trooper pulls you over. They're probably not going to accept the excuse, oh, I didn't see the sign. They have the discretion to say, well, that's too bad. The speed limit's 55. You're getting a ticket, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know it. I didn't know the DFARS 7012 clause was in there. You're still liable for it. Nobody wants to hear that. That's the reality of the matter. Yes. So I would explain it that we need to mitigate our legal risk here, because there are things like the False Claims Act where whistleblowers can do this. And, if I were a business leader in an organization where I had somebody coming up to me from contracts, or maybe even an IT person that knew that we were not doing this, even though I understand, and I know you're very familiar with false claims, it's kind of a high bar for a False Claims Act. But if they're coming to me and saying, hey, proactively saying, we need to fix this problem, I'm going to listen to them, because they could have taken a very different path and maybe been, had some green in their eyes instead, right? Once we do that, then it's just, okay, let us take the time to go explore this and go back to what we've already talked about. Let's look at what kind of provider we need. Let's get some budgetary costs. Don't go in with any preconceived notions. Sometimes I think that the pricing is going to be better than you think it might be, because you might work with a provider that, is more willing to look at what you maybe have already done. Maybe it'll be worse. You don't know, but you need to go with an open mind to understand this is what we have to do to become compliant. Because at the end of the day, here's really what matters when we're framing it to internal leadership. If we've decided, or we've determined this is 40, 50, 60, 70% of our revenue, it's not a matter of we're going to decide if we're going to do this. It's a matter of when, or it's going to completely change the company and potentially put the company out of business.
And then there are some other compliance requirements that you see out there in government contracting. You might even see ISO 27001 for some of these. And what's interesting about that is all of these frameworks, they relate to each other, they map to each other. And so in my previous position, we implemented 800-171 first. And then we decided to go after 3 ISO certifications, 27001 being one of those, which is the security standard for ISO and the information security standard for ISO. And it wasn't hard because we had already done the work for NIST 800-171. There were some gaps that we had to address, but we'd already done a lot of the work, and there wasn't too much, especially on the technical side, that we had to do. If you do have to address other frameworks like ISO, even SOC, I mean, all of these frameworks generally are security best practices, in many cases. There's going to align, and it makes it easier to go after additional compliance frameworks if you need to.
And I agree with you, Jacob, that if you're doing ISO 27001, that starting with 800-171 first is a much better approach, because I know that there was, for a time a couple of years ago, there was a lot of question and push to have reciprocity with different frameworks for CMMC and at least some controls being accepted. And the problem with that, when you really get down to it, is that with 27001, organizations first get to select the controls from ISO 27002 that they want to implement. So it's not always a one-to-one. And then by doing ISO 27001 first, there's a lot more flexibility with the control implementation there, where there's a lot more that can be met by policy, where the same concept cannot be met by policy when you're looking at NIST 800-171 Rev 2. So it doesn't directly align to the way that we do things. I know very common was people would very regularly complain that, like, there's no MFA requirement in 27002, right? So that one came up a lot, and you can meet a lot of other controls in 27002 by having MFA. But what we've done is the same as you. We've worked with organizations where we did we did 800-171 first, and then mapped it to 27001 and 27002, and then worked with an organization to say what other controls from 27002 would improve your information security program, your ISMS, and the ISO words, right? And then we've also worked with an organization where we've mapped 800-171 to the HIPAA requirements. And using the CSF is kind of like the Rosetta Stone to map them over. And then there's still some gaps there, but it's basically we've been able to work with organizations where we can use 800-171, because I think it is a good core, because from the way that we've evaluated it at Aethon Security, about 50% of the controls are technical, 50% of them are, I should say, 40% of them are technical, 45% are administrative, and then about 10% are physical controls, right? I think that math lines up, 45, 10, that equals 100. So we can take that, and it's a great core for a lot of other cybersecurity requirements. But I think the biggest one that all contractors need to be looking to is what's happening with the FAR CUI rule. Essentially, the FAR CUI rule, when it was proposed, it essentially said exactly what the CMMC program is without the third-party verification.
Yeah.
I think that those of us that are read into this and that pay attention to it and what other professionals in the space are saying, what we've seen with DoD already is the thing in the FAR CUI rules, no third-party verification. DoD's already proven that doesn't work, right? That's why you and I are talking on this podcast right now, right? That's why the CMMC program is here.
Yes.
I don't think that it's been working well with DHS. They went down the same method for letting their contractors self-attest. And I think they've been having challenges with that. So we'll see how the FAR CUI rule comes out in its final proposed rule, or not final rules, but its final rule. The big question is, when would that happen, right? It's it took like 8 years for it to even come out.
Right.
I know that Jacob Horn and crew over there does a ton of analysis on how long it takes for rulemaking, but it's something the contractor really should pay attention to, because I think another common misconception about CMMC specifically is the program was written in the Code of Federal Regulation to allow other departments and agencies to use it. It's just DOD made it, and they're the first one to use it. So even if the FAR CUI rule stays as written and they don't require third-party verification, other departments can choose to do that as part of their implementation of the FAR CUI rule. So there's really a lot to digest there, and why I think that just meeting the high watermark, is Richard Wakeman likes to say about the GCI environment, meeting that high watermark of getting certified is going to be the best business angle to go down to more or less ensure you don't have any contractual issues down the road.
All of this effort actually pays off. I remember speaking with Scott Goodwin. He's a penetration tester. He was presenting at CS2, and I asked a question about system hardening, like from STIGs or even PCI, I asked him, does it actually make a difference? Because STIGs, they're very laborious, you know what I mean? And there are hundreds of checks and all of those things. And he said, yes. Oh, yes, it definitely makes a difference, because if functionality is just turned off and a vulnerability, an exploit relies on that functionality being actually on, that can cripple an attacker and actually make it much more difficult for them to exploit your system. And I found the same thing. What I found is that when vulnerabilities came out, the mitigation was to disable this service. We already done that, because of the guidance that DISA had provided. And you can also use CIS, but since, we're DoD contractors, I felt like it would make sense to use STIGs, and I was familiar with those. So, but yeah, all of this compliance work, all of this securing of our systems and everything we're doing here is to make us more resilient against those cyber attacks, against those foreign nation states. Now, there's going to be situations where no matter what you do, you're going to get compromised, but you have a much, much better chance of detecting that compromise and hopefully limiting the damage and the amount of information that they're able to steal. Because I don't remember the latest stats on dwell time and how long it takes to even detect that there's an incident. But I have to believe part of that reason why it's so long is because people and companies just haven't done the work to harden their environments, to monitor their environments and all of that. So, at the end of the day, it is national security, and it comes down to, and also I've been thinking about it from this perspective, our information, and think about information from weapon systems. You know what I mean? Let's say we have an extremely new and innovative weapon system that our adversaries don't have. That in itself is a way to avoid war because that's at a competitive advantage. And it's basically saying, we've got this thing and you don't want us to unleash it on you, So it's almost a way to avoid war. But if that's stolen and the adversary has that technology, we've lost that competitive edge there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it kind of makes me think of the Top Gun 2 movie, the Top Gun Maverick. I remember vividly when they were talking about the unnamed nation state that they were going against, about how they suddenly had they said a 6th generation fighter. And it made me think of the F-35 and the whole story there where, if anyone hasn't heard it yet, like that, the J-31 Chinese fighter jet was literally stolen from the United States, right? And a lot of the naysayers about CMMC, they mention how, well, this isn't going to stop China from getting into our environment. It's like, you know what? You're 100% right. I do not believe that CMMC level 2 is going to stop China from breaking into an environment if they want to. But to your point, what it is going to do is it's going to help us maybe isolate if we use a zero trust architecture design and implementing level or NIST 171, which in my opinion, I think if an organization does it the right way with as many technical implementations as possible, it will inherently do a strong zero trust architecture for a small business, a strong zero trust architecture, but it's going to help isolate that. But also more importantly, to what you said, Jacob, is monitor it. Let us know that it's happening. So that way we can report it to DOD, because another misconception I hope that we can quell in the marketplace and in the defense industrial base is reporting an incident is not a bad mark on your name if you're doing everything the right way. If your publicly accessible system, I remember there was a particular database that had the headers for the database. If it was accessible publicly, you could modify the header and access it without logging in. That's not the contractor's fault. And it was a 0 day. That's not their fault, but they need to report that. And then if China breaks in, now DOD knows about it and they can share that information and then get that patched very quickly, work with the vendor, tell them, make them aware, and also make DOD aware, hey, there's a bad actor potentially in this environment. We need to work with that organization to monitor it. Now, the risk becomes if we're not doing things the right way, right? And then we need to report it. That's going to be some legal risk to the organization. But the large primes, of course, they're going to have a much higher level of cybersecurity. They're probably going to have level 3, and probably have their own business reasons for probably going above and beyond that because of the risks that they face. But we do need to do this for national security and make our organizations more resilient. It's also really important for our businesses to continue operating. I do think a lot of companies, especially small and medium businesses, underestimate the impact that a successful ransomware attack on their organization could cause them to go out of business. It's a real threat. I will say in a past life, I used to be a professional salesperson selling managed network services. I was always selling the FUD, and I hated it. But the reality is that it could happen to us. And in today's world, I think that we need to be very conscious of being resilient and understand that just because we're small doesn't put us outside of that scope, because they're just going to spray out phishing emails and see what works. And all it takes is one click.
Yes. So true. So true. Well, Derek, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for the conversation, sharing your knowledge with us. Really appreciate it. Where can people find you?
Yeah, we can be found at aethonsecurity.com. We have a form there that you can fill out and request some information and have a quick complimentary meeting, kind of go through the process of what it takes to get level 2 certified. But if you're an external service provider, don't contact me. We're not in the business of making competitors.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Jacob.
Hey folks, hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.